Ella no viene hoy, ¿qué tiene clase?
Of the Center of Communitary Development, which is a very interesting institution, 30 years working, and among other things, they train people from the community to be promoters, social development promoters.
Social responsibility.
Yes. So now you know each other with the person-centered approach. Yes, we conquered him. He started as very psychoanalytic, and slowly he became convinced. But anyway, now you know each other.
These are my topics, my favorite topics. Measurement. So I just received an alarm from SACH on conversion respect tester and emotional in individual change assessment. All those topics are my favorites.
Cultural psychologist.
Cultural and
scale.
Yes, and I'm specialized in measurements, in cross-cultural measurements.
Great.
Yes, just receive it right away. filosofía. ¿Sí está? Ah, ok. You're all set. Okay, perfect. Okay. Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Pues bienvenidos a la Universidad Iberoamericana a este magno evento organizado por la Maestría en Desarrollo Humano. Pues antes que nada quisiera agradecer sobre todo al coordinador de la maestría, el doctor Sergio Molano, por pues hacer este espacio, sobre todo para los alumnos de la maestría, pero también abriéndolo a toda la comunidad universitaria, y lo mismo a todas las personas que han estado involucradas en la visita del doctor Jeff. Para empezar, les voy a dar una breve introducción del doctor Jeffrey Cornelius-White. Él es profesor en orientación psicológica en la Universidad Estatal de Missouri y es profesor del programa de doctorado en la Universidad de Missouri-Columbia en el programa de análisis político y de liderazgo educativo. Ha sido profesor invitado en diferentes universidades, entre las que se cuentan la Universidad de Viena, Universidad Nacional de Investigación en Moscú. El doctor Cornelius ha publicado alrededor de 100 trabajos académicos, entre los que se incluyen 4 colecciones internacionales, como el Manual Interdisciplinario del Enfoque Centrado en la Persona, consultorías y psicoterapias centradas en la persona y experienciales, aproximaciones al enfoque centrado en la persona para orientadores psicológicos. Su trabajo metaanalítico, publicado en 2007, es su trabajo más citado. Dentro de los puestos ocupados del doctor Jeff, se encuentran asociaciones internacionales y ya ha fungido como presidente en la Asociación Mundial del Enfoque Centrado en la Persona y Psicoterapia experiencial. Es editor de la revista Person Centered Journal y es coeditor de la revista Terapias Experienciales y Centradas en la Persona. Las áreas de investigación del doctor Cornelius se han enfocado principalmente en la aproximación centrada en la persona, en las áreas de educación y orientación psicológica, en aspectos relacionados con la multiculturalidad en psicología.
Un ejemplo concreto de estos últimos trabajos de investigación, él ha demostrado, por ejemplo, el cambio rápido en las actitudes hacia las personas transgénero, entre otros temas que él ha desarrollado más ampliamente. Así pues, no me queda más que pues, darle la bienvenida al doctor Cornelius y pues recibámoslos con un fuerte aplauso.
Thank you. I would like to thank Dean Alejandra and also Sergio and Alberto and Ibero for inviting me to come here, as well as the students in the Masters in Human Development. I'm teaching a course every evening this week on the same topic, and the students and the faculty who've been attending that have been wonderful. So I really appreciate everyone's welcoming me and participation. So today, I'm going to talk about many different things. And first, I'm going to figure out how do I do this? Upside down. Okay. So I'm going to give you a very quick history of the scientific basis of the person-centered approach. What's the current state of the quantitative research support for the person-centered approach? Then I'll move into something a little bit different, which will talk about the practice and the heart of the person-centered approach using the common factors hypothesis and research. And then finally to talk some about the current state of interdisciplinary research using the person-centered approach. So, the person-centered approach is often considered the most well-known aspect of the third force in psychology, meaning humanistic existential psychology. In a way, it was one of the first forces in psychotherapy research. It was an early proponent of what's sometimes called the fourth force in psychology, meaning multiculturalism. The person-centered approach has used and encourages many different methodologies. There is a large research base in therapy and education, and specifically I'll talk about the quantitative research basis in therapy and education soon. So, Robert Elliott has conducted multiple meta-analyses, and I'm going to talk in particular about one that has been summarized and published in Spanish in a book that Alberto, I, and a couple other people edited. And if you want to look at it, you feel free to. It's by Elliott and Freire. And then I'm going to talk about a meta-analysis that I conducted. And you can see from the number of studies that they're fairly large numbers of studies from many different countries. Then I'm going to talk about the common factors hypothesis, which comes from meta-analyses of psychotherapy in general, not just on the person-centered approach, but many of the themes that emerge in common as successful components of psychotherapy are very similar to the components of person-centered therapy. So, some themes from the 180 studies that Elliott and Freire reviewed. And in Spanish in the book, these themes are clearly identified, so it's fairly easy to skim or read that. At one level, the person-centered approach in psychotherapy or counseling has large pre-post changes. So when you measure the client's health at the beginning and at the end of treatment, there's a large effect. These effects are immediate, meaning often within 1 month of a treatment, by the end of treatment, and then enduring in follow-ups, like at 6 months or a year after treatment. Clients improve over control groups, so when person-centered and experiential psychotherapies have been compared with controls during the same time period, they also show strong effects. And the last one is a little bit complicated. Elliott and Freire conclude that the person-centered approach may be less effective than cognitive behavioral therapy, but when you remove so-called supportive therapies from the group of person-centered approach, it's possible that person-centered and experiential therapies have as large or potentially larger effects than cognitive behavioral therapy, especially in certain areas like the treatment of depression or interpersonal problems. So overall, a large research basis to support the person-centered approach to psychotherapy in these different kinds of ways of trying to approach that. One of the problems politically, though, is that much of the research on the person-centered approach was older than research in cognitive behavioral therapy or some other approaches. Another potential problem is that there's not many randomized controlled studies. There are some, especially in recent years, that show very similar or, like I say, in some cases, better effects than cognitive behavioral therapy. But part of it is that person-centered research or research into person-centered conditions was one of the first waves, and it was done many, many times, but not necessarily with the latest methodologies as much as some approaches that developed later and then used those methodologies in their initial validations. Okay, because this was a meta-analysis I did, I will say a little bit more about it. I have a dozen or so slides, most of which I will skip. But if you have questions, we can go back and look at the specifics within this meta-analysis if you're interested in how does person-centered approach apply within education. The basic two research questions were, what is the relationship between person-centered teacher behaviors and positive learner outcomes, their learning and success in a variety of ways? And what variables, if any, modify that relationship? In other words, when does person-centered approach work better or worse? I followed a guideline of 8 particular criteria in designing the meta-analysis, and I'm going to talk about some of those now. The study needed to have something I could identify as an independent variable and a dependent variable. It needed to be published or written in English or German. It needed to include statistics that I could compute in effect size, like a correlation. The sample I used that fit those criteria included 119 studies. In each of the studies, there were sometimes many different findings. So if there were many variables measured, it might generate multiple different results. So there were 1,450 different findings. The sample size was about 355,000 learners, with about 15,000 teachers representing about 500 schools. We used a method to rate the quality of the original studies using something called the scientific method score. It's basically just a scale on 1 to 5, where 5 is a perfectly wonderful randomized controlled trial, and 1 is something much worse than that, but had some kind of statistic involved. 3 was often kind of the dividing line where there were comparison groups between things, not just a pre-post or correlational type study. We had 4 different coders, 2 for the English studies and 2 for the German studies. We calculated some statistics to make sure that we were seeing things similarly, and anytime there was a difference, there was a discussion to come up with a consensus. But we initially coded the studies separately, independently, so that we would not be as influenced by each other in the study. We attempted to identify 39 different possible moderators. The problem was that in most of these studies, most of these moderators did not exist. So it all depended on what did we have enough information for to include, but the idea was to try to think of everything that might be included in a study that could moderate this. So examples are, what is the age of the students? What is the ethnicity of the students? Where did the study take place? In what year did the study take place? All of those kinds of things to see if the effects might be larger or smaller based upon the moderators. I'm going to give you an overall context to how large are effect sizes in education, because it's a bunch of numbers, and if you don't have a context, it's kind of hard to tell what does that number mean. And in general, in education, the effect sizes are somewhat smaller than in therapy. But of course, in education, people do it a really long time. You know, you start when you're 3 or 4 or 5 years old and go on for some of us. We just never stop going to school. So, the overall average in terms of cognitive outcomes, usually meaning like achievement kinds of learning, is about a correlation of 0.20. And then you can see some of the different kinds of examples of this. So things like how pretty is the school, its physical attributes, how new is it, really has no relationship to student achievement when you study that. It may have relationship to other things, like the amount of money in a community, the amount that students want to attend school, whether or not you can keep your teachers coming back to the school. But in terms of does it help one individual person learn, the effect is almost nothing. So this just gives you a sense about that. So person-centered education at the finding level comes in at about 0.31. And you can see a few other things that can come in potentially higher than that. One of the strongest correlations is how did the student do last year with how they're going to do this year. That's at 0.75, which means like 50% of the variance of why someone the next year does well in school is because they did well last year in school. So, you know, that's about, you know, as strong as we can get in terms of measuring an effect size on of some variable on student achievement. Another thing that's important, often not as politically important, but to psychologists and educators, often as important or more important than learning achievement, are emotional, behavioral, social kinds of outcomes. And in general, most things that people have studied are not as effective at influencing people's emotional, social development within schools. This is a very broad category, effective outcomes. Many of the studies involve students' interest or motivation to learn, but it also involved cooperative relationships, discipline, or problem behaviors. So one thing that is interesting is that the size of a class has more of an effect on the social and emotional outcomes than it does on the student achievement. This is another politically important thing because many times class sizes get larger and larger because it's more expensive to keep the size smaller. But when we're talking about developing persons in a more holistic sense, which the person-centered approach is often concerned with, class size does make more difference. So within this broader social realm, most things that have been researched end up being less effective than person-centered education. This gives you an overall sense of the studies and where they fell. So almost everything had a positive effect when person-centered approach was being evaluated by itself or in comparison to other variables. And the effects, you know, kind of range from about 0 to about 0.8 or so. This is at the study level, so it's a little different than the finding level. So some studies will rank higher than others. There's 119 studies, but 1,450 findings. So it's a different way of looking at it. But here the average effect size was about 0.39. So I'm going to skip a lot of slides here. If you're interested in specific variables that might be affected by person-centered education, or interested in which person-centered variables like empathy versus unconditional positive regard versus positive relationships overall, and how much do those affect, then we can go back to some of those slides later on in the presentation. The conclusions from this meta-analysis is that on average, learner-centered instruction or person-centered education improves student outcomes an average of 31%. And what I should have said earlier is that for this meta-analysis, I had classic studies on the person-centered approach dating all the way back to the late 1940s. The earliest study I could find was about the reduction of fascist attitudes after World War II, and comparing a non-directive, because person-centered didn't exist as a term, but it was the same approach, non-directive, client-centered, person-centered, comparing non-directive teaching with where there was kind of a facilitated group with lots of student participation, compared to a traditional lecture within a psychology class. And fascist attitudes are more reduced when there's more student participation and there's more facilitation by the teacher and less telling by the teacher. But I also included many studies that go by what's now called the learner-centered model. Barbara McCombs is perhaps the best proponent and researcher within the learner-centered model. It, in part, was supported by the American Psychological Association and the American Educational Research Association. So it's a newer model that has a lot of similarities to the person-centered approach, and one of its main variables is positive student relationships, which is kind of like a composite of empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. Sorry about the digression, but I forgot to mention kind of what did I mean by person-centered approach to education. So there is a large variation in results, especially by measurement perspective. This is something that goes right back to the original person-centered theory and is supported in the literature. This is something that shows up the same way in psychotherapy literature. So by measurement perspective, usually if we're looking at something like empathy, we can ask students, how much do you feel like your teacher understands you and empathizes with you and values what you have to say? You can ask an observer. So there's a lot of audio tapes that have been listened to and rated by different people. Or you can ask the teacher, how good do you feel like the empathy is with your students? I would like for you to guess, or perhaps you know, which way of measuring empathy is most associated with student learning and positive student outcomes? Asking the student, an observer, or the teacher? The student. And the classic formulation was that it's the perception of these facilitative conditions by the client or by the student that is most important, and research bears that out, that when students are asked, there's a greater relationship with the student's achievement. There are certain kinds of outcomes that are more affected by person-centered education. The strongest effects are on participation. If you listen to them, students talk more. It's kind of logical. But if one of the major things you're interested in is active student engagement, person-centered education has about the strongest effect on that. If you're interested in divergent, creative, critical thinking, it's actually a lot of different things, and some of those are not the same, but for the purpose of the meta-analysis, anything that sort of fit that broad kind of critical thinking category, I put together, and again, the person-centered approach is particularly good at that. That's also something that I think Rogers would be pleased to hear, because he was interested in creating persons who would be innovative, who would be challenging, who had the capacity to learn, not just were learning specific things, but were developing how to be learners. Math and verbal achievement was affected more than, say, social studies or science kinds of achievement. Satisfaction, that is when you ask students how satisfied with the class, is affected. Dropout, meaning will students continue in school or will they stop going to school? Attendance. Motivation, meaning how much do I like math? When they have a person-centered teacher, they tend to like math more than when they have a lecturing teacher. Their own self-efficacy, grades, their IQ. There's only a few studies, and they're all from the 1970s, but they measured elementary kids' intelligence before and after having a person-centered teacher, and intelligence improved. I'm pretty skeptical about that, but that's what the results showed. Social skills and disruptive behavior all had above average outcomes, meaning higher than other kinds of intervention from those initial contexts I showed you with 0.20 for cognitive outcomes and 0.11 for effective outcomes. What elements of person-centered or learner-centered education were most effective? Positive relationships overall, empathy, warmth, non-directivity, which was a measure that mostly came from German studies, encouraging learning and thinking were all above average innovations. And the variable encouraging learning and thinking is solely from the learner-centered model, the newer version. Things that were not very good at predicting outcome within the person-centered approach were teacher congruence or genuineness, as well as how much did the teacher believe in a learner-centered model. Like, do you believe every student can learn and that you're trying to adapt to the student and that they will succeed? If you believe in that, or you believe that you must reinforce and force everyone to learn and motivation is not intrinsic, your beliefs really have almost no relationship to the student outcomes, which was kind of interesting. I think it may have relationships to other things, which I didn't explore, so having learner-centered attitudes may help you have more empathy, but it's really the empathy that's connected, not the beliefs, for example. Things that were not much affected was negative motivation. Students who want to avoid work can also avoid work in a person-centered class just as well as they can in a lecture class. So it increases positive interest, but it doesn't really decrease negative motivation. Science and batteries were less effective. By batteries, it sounds funny. I mean achievement tests that were particularly high validity, that were across lots of different disciplines. So I don't know what you have in Mexico, but in the United States, things that would be more like the Scholastic Aptitude Test or the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, these broad achievement tests were not particularly affected by person-centered education. This is important as a critique because some of those are the best measurements of achievement and they're not so much affected. Whereas when you ask students how much they learned, or you look at their grades, or you give them a particular subject test, those things seem to be more effective. So these are some overall conclusions about how does the person-centered approach show quantitatively in the field of education. Okay. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and talk more about kind of what is the person-centered approach. Many of you probably already know that, but I'm going to take a particular perspective or angle in explaining the person-centered approach that's based upon a common factors hypothesis. This comes in large part from the work of a recent book that I've done, which is called Person-Centered Approaches for Counselors. It's part of a series of different psychotherapy orientations like cognitive behavioral or psychoanalytic, and using common factors research to link how does common factors show in these different therapy approaches. I am a little biased, but it is my perspective that the person-centered approach is most clearly and easily explained by common factors compared to any other approach. Part of this was that Rogers' initial assertions, he he had two initial assertions, one in 1957 and one in 1959, about what he called the necessary and sufficient conditions. The 1957 work was explicitly not about person-centered therapy, but was about his view of what helps in any therapy. The 1959 version of the necessary and sufficient conditions was explicitly about how does person-centered therapy work. They're very similar, but part of what I'm trying to say is that in a way, he was promoting an idea of common factors. So if you're a psychoanalyst making an interpretation, or you're a cognitive behavioral therapist working with exposure or cognitive restructuring or whatever, to the extent that the client finds what you're doing to be empathic or accepting, it will be effective. That was Rogers' initial assertion. You can use any technique, but it's the way that it's perceived by a client that makes the difference. That was the original assertion in 1957 by Rogers. And it's somewhat similar to the common factors hypothesis, which is, as long as you're doing a bona fide, legitimate therapy, not something completely made up without a theoretical research tradition, then what accounts for change is very much similar to the same components in another form of therapy. So that's kind of the hypothesis, and it's based upon a meta-analysis that's looking at different components measured in different kinds of approaches. So I'm going to explain the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions and show some links back to the common factors hypothesis. I'm going to talk about one particular type of therapy that has become more researched and more popular in recent years, called client-directed outcome-informed therapy. Sometimes it's called evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence. Then I'm going to talk about some multicultural considerations of the person-centered approach. The person-centered approach was uniquely involved in multicultural considerations from its inception, even though it's not necessarily been viewed as a multicultural approach by people outside the approach. Historically, it's very easy to situate that way in comparison to any other major therapy approach where it's harder to situate it multiculturally. And then last, I'm going to talk about a couple of works that I edited that were major handbooks that looked at interdisciplinary research on the person-centered approach, as well as different kinds of applications. So that will be a quick overview to give you the scope of how has it been researched or applied beyond the research I just reviewed in psychotherapy or education. So that'll be what I conclude with. So I'm kind of going into a second half of this now. So one of the first research-based explanations of the common factors found 4 common factors across different approaches to therapy. That the explanation was that 100% of what caused change in clients could be explained by these common factors, the first one being the client. That is, that 40% of why clients get better has to do with qualities that do not have to do with therapy and do have to do with the client or things about the client's life outside of therapy. Things like their social network, their wealth, their attractiveness, their own motivation, their own participation in therapy. So the largest common factor is the client. This is something that fits very well with the person-centered approach, because the person-centered approach saw originally that the only motivation is the actualizing tendency. The therapist's role is to try to bring out that. The therapist is not the major agent, they're just creating a relationship in which the client will grow. This is somewhat supported by the idea that the largest common factor is the client. More recent meta-analyses have shown that the client factors could be as high as 87%, meaning that the majority, not just the largest category, but the majority of why clients improve does not have much to do with us as therapists or professionals. In this case, client was also seen as error. In other words, things that we can't measure well were all grouped into this client, or what's called extra-therapeutic variable. Whereas 13% was things that have more to do with us, or specific techniques, relationship, those kinds of things. 1% had to do with the specific approach, and 8% to specific techniques. So there are some techniques that seem to have decent effects, like exposure for phobias. It's one of the most supported specific techniques when you look across psychotherapy literature. The main thing I'm trying to say here, though, is that the client seems to be the major factor when you look at common factors research. Back to the initial hypothesis, 30% was due to the therapy relationship. And the best way of measuring the therapy relationship is from the perspective of the client, which is kind of interesting because in a way it's still the client. And then 15% was seen as techniques and specific models that might be used in a given situation for a given problem. And the remaining 15% was hope or expectancy, or what's called placebo. How much do people think they'll get better? How credible is this therapist? Those kinds of things. So when you look at this, the bulk of the common factors, regardless of what psychotherapeutic orientation is used, is contained within the therapist relationship with the client and the client's own characteristics or factors beyond therapy. This is very similar to what the person-centered approach would assert, and then I'll kind of go through how that works. But that's another stream of quantitative research that is not explicitly related to the person-centered approach, but fits, in my opinion, better with the person-centered approach than dynamic, cognitive behavioral systems, Gestalt, other kinds of approaches. So at this point, I'm going to tell you about the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions. The basic theory was that if these 6 conditions are present, then therapeutic change would happen. And it wasn't necessary to have anything else, and those 6 alone were sufficient. Many people now don't necessarily think that they're necessary or sufficient or optimal. People have a variety of viewpoints of them, but I'll present them first as they were. Most frequently, what's thought when people think about the necessary and sufficient conditions are only 3 of them. These 3 are sometimes called the core conditions. They are the ones that are more about the therapist. They're the ones that are usually taught more and tried to foster in therapists. So they're congruence, which is also called genuineness, transparency, authenticity. It's a very messy condition in my view. Unconditional positive regard, which is the scientific version of something that earlier was often viewed as acceptance or a non-possessive love. And the last one was empathic understanding, which is often summarized as empathy. There were 3 other conditions, though. The first of the 6 was contact, meaning that the counselor and the client must be in contact, kind of like there must be some minimal relationship or interaction between them. There's an entire version of person-centered and experiential therapy called pre-therapy, which is based on facilitating contact when contact is not readily apparent. For example, if someone is suffering from schizophrenia or has an intellectual deficiency, they may not have contact with reality. They may not have contact with who they are or their emotions. They may not have contact or awareness of you. So in those situations, there's a whole approach that was designed to try to increase people's contact to then allow therapy to happen. What's interesting is that in trying to create contact, often therapy was already happening. But the second of the 6 conditions was incongruence. The simplest way to get this one is just that a client is suffering. There needs to be an intrinsic motivation on the part of the client. Often it was looked at as the client is vulnerable. They have at least a little awareness that they have some kind of problem. They may be anxious. Different ways of explaining that. But essentially that there's some kind of conflict, suffering within the client. This is partly important because there needed to be motivation. There has been some research with people classically not considered to have self-awareness of a problem, like people with antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, sociopathy, or some people with substance abuse problems where all of the problems in their life they blame on other people, not on themselves. But person-centered approach has still been shown to be effective with these groups, particularly the motivational interviewing version of the person-centered approach has some of the strongest research on affecting change with people with addiction concerns. So the original hypothesis was there must be contact, there must be client incongruence, but in later years, those two have been shown not as necessary. You can still do person-centered work even when clients are out of contact or they're not aware or owning that they themselves are vulnerable and incongruent. The 6th condition was perception, and it's one that I've already mentioned a couple times and invited you to remind me of the answer, which is that the client must perceive the 3 core conditions. The original hypothesis was just really about they must perceive empathy and unconditional positive regard, but the research shows that congruence is also something that is probably reaches the threshold of demonstrable relationship to therapy outcome as long as it's measured from the client's perspective. One approach that has grown out of the common factors research is by Miller and Duncan and their colleagues, and it's called something like client-directed or outcome-informed therapy. The basic idea is they propose that why do the best therapists have the best outcomes regardless of what approach they're using comes from common factors, and one factor in particular they've emphasized, which is that the best counselors seem to be adaptive and responsive to their clients. In a way, it's related to empathy. If one client needs this or that for you to do and you're empathic to that, that's a way of being adaptive. But their version is that you give assessments every psychotherapy session that explicitly asks for the client's perception of your behavior and how well did the session go. They suggest using an extremely easy session rating scale that has only 4 items that can be done when people cannot read, that after the first time can be done in about 10 seconds. It's a very easy measure, but it asks for feedback explicitly so that therapists will alter their behavior to be more suited to the particular client. Part of the idea of this is that because the largest piece of why clients get better is due to the client, why not try to figure out what are the client's resources, the client's perceptions, the client's own model of what will help them to adapt to that client model and the client perception. As I'm using the word perception, I'm trying to highlight that the 6th condition in person-centered therapy fits very well with client-directed, outcome-informed of trying to solicit their perception and adapt to that. Okay. I'm going to give you a kind of visual representation of how I understand the person-centered approach. The healing element in the person-centered approach is unconditional positive regard. There have been a few people that have made this assertion. In some respects, when you read some of the early writings, this is seen. But definitely the work of Gerald Bodzarth has promoted this idea. And the idea is that it's actually love that's helping people heal. There's been multiple works connecting attachment theory to the person-centered approach. But the basic idea is that people suffer when they're not in relationship to others. When they are in loving relationships to others, they often don't suffer. Or their suffering is much easier to handle and often results in something beneficial, like an opportunity, rather than an emergency that destroys things in their life. So the basic thing is that the light, like a flashlight, is the healing element, which essentially is a non-possessive love. Client perception is critical to alter your empathy. In a way, there is an implied question every time a person-centered counselor makes an empathic statement to a client. The implied question is, does that fit? Is that right? Are you perceiving my empathy? Am I with you? And the perception is trying to then go back and influence the empathy. So the empathy is essentially the direction of how, maybe I can do this, the direction of where exactly are you going to point the light that is the unconditional positive regard. So accurate, precise, emotionally evocative, connected to the meanings, the feelings the person has, that kind of empathy puts the love exactly where it needs to be. What is the person suffering with? What are their conflicts? What are the meanings and feelings that they have? Good empathy allows the love to go exactly where it needs to go to help the person develop. The main engine of what's causing change is the client themselves, especially their own incongruence. It's kind of like a classic, I guess, Piaget thing about tension, and that tension then resolves into some new learning. But the basic idea is that the actualizing tendency is working through there's some conflict or tension in the person when they're loved with precise empathy to the spots of their incongruence, then the motivation within them is what's causing the change. So, the use of the session rating scale is very important for the feedback loop. Very simple scale. There's a lot more complicated ones, like the Working Alliance has much research. But the session rating scale has been validated in response to these other better measures of the relationship or of the process of therapy, of the session quality. There's one other measure that client-directed, outcome-informed, common factors-based therapy uses, which is called the outcome rating scale. It's a very simple client symptom, client quality of life measure. The idea with this is using what we know about the dose-dependent effect of therapy. So when you look at how much dose, like a drug, how much of a medicine do you need? In the case of therapy, there's a dose-dependent effect, where 3 or 4 sessions is usually where the most good is reached for the amount of sessions. In other words, the largest amount of change for the largest amount of people will happen usually within 1 month of therapy. Doesn't mean all problems are resolved. In fact, many problems have not changed at all, but the client's own perspective, their own sense of hope, usually changes within a month that they can get better. There's other things that we know about specific percentages of clients that get better at 26 sessions or 72 sessions. There's more research on how much therapy and what types of therapy are needed for effective change. But one of the most robust findings in looking at that, at the meta-analyses on the amount of time or the amount of therapy needed is in a magic number of 1 month or 4 sessions. So the outcome rating scale is basically saying if you don't see some reliable change within 1 month, something's wrong. Doesn't mean everybody will be all better, but it does mean because most clients get at least measurably better within 1 month, the suggestion is if you're measuring that every week and you see after 1 month that the client has not gotten somewhat better, you need to adapt and do something different. The basic idea, again, is trying to solicit the client perception of what do they need, and one way is, are they getting better? If they're not getting better, you need to do something different. So it's a formalized way of taking feedback from the client, of using the client's perception to alter what happens in therapy. It may mean that specific techniques or referrals or additional treatments, whatever. But if you don't have some kind of positive change in a month, then that's a sign that you need something. So in addition to kind of a weekly check-in, are you satisfied with how it went today, there's a check-in at that 1 month basis. You can do some other things with the outcome rating scale, but that's its primary purpose, is to use what we know about the dose-dependent effect to try to solicit client feedback to make the therapist more effective. Why I think all of these fit with the person-centered approach is it's very much about, are you empathic in a broad way? Is there perception from the client that's influencing how you're going to interact with someone? The use of these scales is associated with greater retention rates. In other words, clients come back to therapy rather than just go once or twice and you never see them again. They provide a customer service. The customer is always right. It's a kind of slogan in much of capitalism, and it's a similar kind of idea of you're a service provider, so you want to provide the best service. Fits with that cultural thing happening. And a way that I particularly like it, which I hope is somewhat important to this audience, is that it assists with counselor development and supervision. It provides an objective way of getting client feedback that goes beyond my own expert ability to supervise or help someone develop. I know that I'm probably better at measuring the empathy, unconditional regard, and congruence of the student counselor than they are. But I also know that the research shows it's the clients that are better than me. So I think it's an ethical responsibility, almost, for people who are involved in the training and supervision of counselors to try to solicit that client feedback and let it influence the supervisor, just like it influences the therapist. It also helps in situations where you do not where a counselor is not developing the way you would like them to. In the United States, there's been some studies about what percentage of people enter a master's program or a doctoral program and don't get out of the program, especially related to supervisors or teachers in those graduate programs not wanting the student to get out. There's this notion of gatekeeping, that we as educators have a responsibility to prevent harm to the public by stopping counselors who are not able to adequately develop. At my university, I have a tendency to get along well with our worst students. I like that. One of my teachers was Nat Raskin, who was one of the founders of the person-centered approach, and he taught at Northwestern, and he shared with me before he died that whenever the faculty didn't like a student, they gave him to him. So one concern I have is that not always my colleagues in my own institution or other institutions are really doing the best they can to help a counselor develop. sometimes a counselor's not very good, or sometimes they just are combative or argumentative, challenging to faculty, and that can be hard on faculty, just like sometimes clients can be hard on therapists. But to me, it's important to put the client perspective in, because sometimes those counselors are still effective. They don't make good supervisees. They're not necessarily agreeable with the authority, but they might actually be doing good work with clients, and they might actually be doing work in a different way than the traditional counselor does. So that's one reason I also like it, is because it's somewhat a student advocacy thing in the event that the student happens to do things differently than the supervisor wants them to do, but nevertheless you can see positive effects on the session rating scale or outcome rating scale. Their clients are getting better, their clients are satisfied, it's just the darn supervisor who doesn't like what they're doing. I also find it very helpful in those situations where the counselor should not be practicing. If it's only my view that this counselor does not perform well, I feel much shakier, much less secure to fail a student, to tell them they cannot be a counselor this year. I feel more secure if their clients don't come back. Their clients give them low ratings about their quality of the session, and the clients don't get better on the outcome rating scale. In that instance, I can say to them, I've been telling you I have some concerns about your therapy behavior, and your clients have similar concerns. You're not effective. I don't see how I can promote you now to go out and practice in the field. It provides a clear way to help students develop in those situations. I can say, have several clients that do find the sessions okay, that do get better. Then, whatever my worries were about you, I can see that you're trying to change and develop. So this last little part here, assist with supervision and development, is something I've been thinking about researching, because I have several years of these scales on people, but I'm overwhelmed with how much information it is, and I don't have any money to do the research and whatever, but I'd like to, because to me, I think that we do not have great supervision research compared to we do have great psychotherapy research. And in particular, I'm interested in using these measures to try to improve the quality of supervision and to improve the advocacy for students who don't get along with faculty but maybe are good counselors, as well as providing a better basis for when faculty do not want to promote or graduate or license their counselors. Okay. I'm going to switch gears here again a little bit. Multicultural considerations in the person-centered approach. In 1922, Rogers was selected as a representative of the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association, to be a representative at a World Christian Student Federation conference in China. He kept a diary of his trip, and recently I've had that diary published so that you can read his original words. He carried around this enormous, heavy typewriter all across this 6-month journey and typed on it every day. And he edited a newsletter, and the people that traveled with him were historically important. They were Nobel Peace Prize winners, Yale University faculty. He interacted with the mayor of Seoul, Korea, the chancellor of Germany, a variety of people that I can't remember. But this was influential on him because he was just 20 years old. He was a Midwest farm boy, kind of sheltered life, brought up in an evangelical, fundamentalist Christian family. And his trip there changed the course of what did he study. And it changed the course of how he thought about the world. So in other words, his own formation in late adolescence was extremely influenced by interaction with people from all throughout the world, at a time period that was also really interesting in history. The Soviet Union was formed in that same year. China was involved in a civil war. It was between the two world wars. there was a lot of global tension, so it wasn't all a nice situation. And he spoke with a lot of compassion about the differences in power between cultures, particularly as regards women. He was quite taken aback by the state of the world, and while he had some similar biases that any white man from America might have had then, it was clear that he was wrestling to try to allow that enormous experience to influence who he was over time. As I mentioned, one of the first dissertations I can find was on specifically fascism, and that word translates fine, right? In Spanish? Fascism? Yeah, okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about three different links here. So power in particular in the person-centered approach is unique compared to other sorts of psychotherapy approaches that fits really well with empowerment and a variety of multicultural concepts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the American Counseling Association's model of multicultural competencies and how they fit very well with the person-centered approach. And I'm going to talk about a few religious themes in particular that I think fit well with the person-centered approach. Rogers was very Christian. After that trip, he changed and went to graduate school in theology and became a minister, and then saw himself as non-religious for most of his life. The end of his life, he got more mystical. That's his own trajectory, but I think that there's several things that fit well with religions in addition to his own more humanistic, secular view of his approach. Okay. Power can be viewed within. I have power as a person, each of you do. Power can be viewed with. Together we can accomplish something. And power can be viewed over. I have more power than you do at the moment because I get the microphone. So, in the person, the discussion of power comes a lot from a friend of mine, Jillian Proctor, and her work with the person-centered approach in ethics. And it takes a kind of feminist perspective on power. Anyway, power within fits very much with the actualizing tendency. Power with fits very much with a facilitative relationship. And power over is largely something that Rogers is trying to avoid or subvert or give away the power that the therapist has. The person-centered approach has deep social justice roots going way back, as I sort of gave you a couple examples. Power can be viewed as structural in terms of the privilege that a person has, or their status, or their prejudice, and how trying to empathize and be unconditional results in often a change in our own self-awareness or congruence to recognize how we have power, how we have bias, and it creates a sense of humility and ongoing attention to be open to how might I be using power over people that I don't know, which I think is very important. The more power in society you get, to have more awareness of that. I think one of the main themes of the person-centered approach I'd like to share is that the person-centered approach is trying to give the gift of helping clients be able to solve their problems rather than offering a solution to their problem. Teach a man to fish rather than give them fish, to have the old Jesus quote in a way. So, multiculturalism, lots of different definitions, and social justice is a term that's used a lot, and but there's a definition for you. In particular, the American Counseling Association talks about 3 competencies that counselors should have regarding multicultural issues. The first one is an awareness of one's own culture and biases. Where does that come from? A lot of that has to do with the concept of privilege and the ways that we have power or status that works subtly beyond our own awareness typically, and trying to increase that. This very much fits with which person-centered core condition? What core condition would this fit well with? Yeah. So it's about your self-awareness, but particularly looking at congruence as partially a cultural phenomenon, not just an individual phenomenon. Understanding of clients' worldviews, which one does that fit well with? Empathy. And again, appreciating that the way we understand someone always is individualized to that particular person, but there's also hypotheses. If you're empathizing with a woman, a person who's educated, a person from a different ethnicity than you, there's certain cultural variables that help define their experience that may help you to empathize with them. Practicing culturally appropriate intervention strategies. This one does not fit quite as well with any of the core conditions, but in my view, it does fit very well with empathy and unconditional positive regard to a certain extent, and it fits even better with the common factors client-directed element of what do you need to get better? And adjusting through the feedback loop, how do you behave that accomplishes that? These are some common elements of diversity. I don't remember exactly why I have this slide. Maybe it's to introduce that religion is one element, because I'm going to give you some examples of how some religious concepts fit with the person-centered approach. Yeah, I guess that's why. Because many times religion and faith practice, at least in the United States, are not dealt with in courses on multicultural issues. Race and ethnicity is dealt with by far the most. Gender, sexual orientation, disability, particularly in schools, disability gets a lot of attention in the United States. Part of it is because religion and politics are difficult to deal with in terms of laws and how that works, but kind of providing a couple of things there with regards to ethical or moral or value kinds of statements that are involved in the person-centered approach with the last couple of bullets. So things like a deliberate attempt to empower through disciplined practice of respecting each person, through non-interference, something involving skilled companionship, trying to have the means and the ends consistent, so you're not doing something for an outcome, but what you're doing is for the outcome itself, and you're trying to model a way of interacting so that people become more self-accepting, that they're more empathic and have better relationships with other people through the process of having a better relationship with the counselor. Okay, a few things. I personally have really enjoyed thinking about the concept of Wu Wei in Taoism. Rogers himself quoted Lao Tzu, and other people have looked at that over time. I grew up Christian, and I think the idea that we all make mistakes and God loves us anyway is a concept that is close to unconditional positive regard. The practice of trying to increase unconditional positive regard, I think, can be helped by meditating and learning to not have that attachment to what outcome is going to happen, or to that your perspective is correct versus the client's perspective. This is a quote about Wu Wei that I particularly like. "The softest in the world surpasses the hardest in the world. What has no substance can penetrate what has no opening. Thereby I know the value of non-action. The value of teaching without words and accomplishing without action is understood by few in the world." And often the stream is seen as a kind of symbol of Wu Wei, how there's no action, but at the same time it's one of the most powerful forces in terms of forming the valley that is Mexico City, for example, through water. And there's a kind of paradox in the person-centered approach about there's stability, but at the same time there's always a flow or movement. Okay, some outworkings of the religious concepts. There's an aim for harmony without controlling others, believing in every client's capacity, regardless of their circumstances or their past or future actions, that each emotion and experience is to be viewed compassionately, but at the same time dispassionately, so that you're tolerating and being with people regardless of what they're going through, trusting the process of being with, facilitating rather than prescribing what a client should do or choose or how they should do it. Okay, I'm switching gears again to go to another element that fits with the theme of contemporary research and practice in the person-centered approach. So one of the things that's kind of unique about the person-centered approach compared to, say, cognitive behavioral therapy or psychodynamic, certainly psychodynamic has had a huge influence on the way everyone understands the world. Behaviorism has also had a very large effect on the way people understand the world and about how sciences of learning have been developed. But the person-centered approach had unique applications almost immediately. As I was saying, some of the work on classroom applications of the person-centered approach is basically as old as the psychotherapy approach. So there's been a long tradition of applying the person-centered approach for a lot of different purposes. But there's also a way in which a lot of research from different lines of thought, different disciplines within the university have provided some support for the person-centered approach and provide some opportunities to alter what is good about the core of the person-centered approach that might be advanced by research from other areas as we learn more about anything from any discipline. So this was an enormously broad scope project to try to bring together people from, I think there's over 50 authors in one of the handbooks and another 35 in the other, from dozens of countries and different continents to try to get at some of the ways in which it's been applied in different disciplines. So some of the types of research or disciplines in the handbook of research and theory involved cognitive and neuroscience. In particular, there were several in that theme, a few on mindfulness, how there's research on developmental relating or development theories like attachment and how that can be linked with and show some similar concepts and suggest some potential changes to advancing person-centered practice. Positive psychology, systems theory, interdisciplinary systems theory like chaos theory. One of the most frequently downloaded chapters is by a game theorist who I was thrilled. I was like just reading on game theory, and I was like, in the back of one of his books, he talks about his partner as a person-centered counselor. I was like, oh my gosh, I've got to invite this guy to be in this book. And he was really concerned about the money and the copyright. I was like, it's an academic book. No one's ever going to buy it. There is no money. And thankfully, it's been downloaded a lot. It's in the Springer online collection that a lot of libraries have. So I get nothing from the downloads, though. So it's like, there's no money still. Like, I can't give the guy anything. But it's a fascinating chapter about how game theory relates to the person-centered approach. Spirituality, different kinds of science of, what's the term? Methods of science, history of science, what is the, I don't know, methodology things, yeah. Applications, certainly different kinds of clinical applications that psychologists might use, education, children and family, but also business and leadership. My work at the University of Vienna has been with computer scientists. I know nothing about computer science. But they have a lot of things that is about project management and under what conditions does teamwork facilitate innovation. So there's several studies related to that. Conflict transformation, nonviolent communication was an approach that grew out of the University of Chicago at the same time that has many practitioners throughout the world. They don't have a great research tradition, but they've been extremely effective in training and promoting a vast number of practitioners in the world. And constructive international kinds of communication as well, ever since 1922, Rogers was sort of involved in constructive international communication, and certainly in the 70s and 80s, Rogers was involved in some key hot spots of tension in the world, like apartheid in South Africa and conflict in Northern Ireland and interactions between Europe and the Soviet Union and things like that. There are many concept maps in the books, in these two interdisciplinary research books. My co-editor was a computer scientist, and then another one was a cognitive science, neuroscience person. So I'm not really the originator of most of these concept maps, but this gives some sense about how the person-centered approach is studied or confirmed by or relates to, has been applied in. It's a kind of broad scope way of looking at what the project was. Each of the individual chapters would be potentially on one of these things, but it's a lot to take in, and I'm sorry, I don't know exactly how to convey all of that verbally if you can't see it, but it just in the center has person-centered approach and then is studied or confirmed by or relates to a variety of things like natural science, medicine, interdisciplinary systems theory, psychotherapy, health and intensive care, medicine, technology, enhanced learning, those kinds of things. It's okay if I go to the next slide? One of the things we did after all of this was to try to think about how is the person-centered approach kind of a theory of everything, or like an emergent paradigm to look at things. So one thing is that it was difficult for our little brains to try to put all this together, and so one conclusion we came to is that the person-centered approach is kind of more than a theory. The second thing is that the person-centered approach values experience first. So the idea is that experience is always primary, and person-centered approach should adapt to what people's experience is. The third thing is that there does seem to be some support for the actualizing tendency as the only motive and inner compass towards growth that can be explicitly expressed in the image of the human being, but also in terms of other life processes. One of the assertions that Rogers had near the end of his life was he suggested a second motivational construct called the formative tendency, which was not so much about each individual person realizing who they are, but more about how people interact with the environment and with each other, and that there may be a general trajectory of progress in the universe. Again, he got a bit more mystical and more sloppy in his thinking, I think, but at the same time, very interesting.
What is that concept?
Formative tendency. This gives some sense of that overall kind of theory. Other things is the person-centered approach often focuses on the quality of interpersonal interactions. The person-centered is a whole person approach, suggesting that it's important ethically not to reduce people, but to appreciate them in their broadness, I guess. And that the person-centered approach is in a way of being. It's not exactly only a set of techniques or procedures or specific applications. The person-centered relationship applies to the various stages of life, and there's work trying to explain its involvement. So necessary for infants, helpful for children and students, all the way to the end-of-life palliative care kinds of circumstances. There are multiple levels at which the PCA is studied and is present. Some of the more interesting chapters, in my view, also concern cognitive neuroscience. I have a relatively unsophisticated understanding of cognitive neuroscience compared to my colleagues or those chapters, but I found them very interesting, looking at things like mirror neurons and how much of perception is related to interaction with the environment or people and other concepts. This is a kind of how the different constructs of the person-centered approach relate to each other. I really doubt you're going to get much of that right now unless you take a picture of it and study, but it's a kind of way of looking at how all of these different things like organismic valuing process and symbolization and experiencing and all of these self-structure and stuff can be related to other concepts within the approach. The idea of how the formative tendency relates somewhat to the actualizing tendency or co-actualizing tendency, which is not a term that Rogers used, but one that some people have later used. This in particular looks at one of the chapters on neuroscience and how the therapist and client relate at different neurobiological and psychosocial levels, how there tends to be an activation or deactivation of different kinds of things at those different levels. There's some interesting studies about different chemicals and how voice tone can be correlated with different kinds of chemical responses that are parallel or different between interactions between therapists and clients. There's a group of researchers from Harvard that had one of the chapters in it that was kind of above my head, but I understood it long enough to make sure that the grammar was good. So this is another one from that same, another image from that chapter that relates to neuroscience. Focusing is a particular person-centered approach. So a lot of times people say person-centered and experiential, referring to emotion-focused therapy or process-directive or focusing as different forms on the experiential wing of it. And so this is a kind of a connection of different implicit processes that are explained within thinking on the edge and focusing and those kinds of concepts that come more from the Ginlin wing of the person-centered approach. Person-centered approach in management. Just give you a second to look at that. In particular, agile management is a concept that the project management computer scientist folks have tried to link with a lot. Kind of talking about 21st century skills is a phrase in English, and what are challenges and opportunities, and how some of the difficulties of the current world with its rapid pace of change, rapid ways in which we interact through our smartphones, and how a lot of that has to do with trying to learn how to learn and how to adapt more than traditional modes of you're trying to memorize certain kinds of things in schooling, for example. How a lot of employers are interested in soft skills or specific kinds of communication and interpersonal skills, and how those might be met well by this classical old model of the person-centered approach. This is a concept mapped as relates to different concepts in attachment theory in the person-centered approach. And that is the end of what I intended to present. And I believe my watch says 2:30, so I'm just right on time. But I'm glad to go back through some of that slower, and particularly just to give you a reminder of things I went through was a meta-analysis on person-centered therapy, then one on person-centered education, looking at the common factors hypothesis, as well as looking at how that fits well with the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions, and then moving on to interdisciplinary research. So if any of that stimulates questions or helps you remember something you wanted to talk about, I hope that quick summary helps with that. Thank you.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias al doctor Jeff, y ahorita abrimos entonces un espacio pues para discusión, comentarios, preguntas, y pues aquí las pueden hacer en inglés directamente, o si necesitan ayuda, pues aquí tenemos a Alberto Segrera, que también es muy bueno en el inglés y en estos conceptos de la teoría muy específicas. Así que pues bueno, el foro está abierto. Jeff.
I guess so.
Entonces,
I can
vamos
just
a
talk
pasar,
loud.
ajá, vamos a pasar el micrófono por si se escucha este micrófono.
Sí, porque hay quienes están siguiendo en línea.
Ah, sí, entonces será. Oye, también aquí lo veo.
Que hablen fuerte o usen el micrófono.
Could I call you Jeff?
Please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jeff, for being here. My name is Juan Carlos. I'm from Colombia. I'm here as a student in the Master of Human Development. And I would like to know how did you choose those countries and those schools? And did you find any representative difference between them?
Okay. You mean in the meta-analysis of education?
Yeah.
How did I choose the countries and schools? Okay, so,
And why?
and why? Basically, if I could read it, I included it. So, I had a relationship with a colleague at the University of Vienna, so if she could read it, meaning it was in German, then we could do it. So it was really a practical decision. The schools were just chosen because whatever studies were done, they were included. What I will say is that I didn't talk much about moderators, but location of the study did not have a relationship to the outcome. There were some studies done in Brazil that were then written about in English, but I don't know of any from Mexico or Colombia that were included. However, ethnic minority representation in the sample was associated with higher success. So the more kind of white European only the study was, the lower the effects were. It's kind of related to your question. So.
Jeff, congratulations for all this job that you have been
Thank you.
doing. It's great for the PCA and for the world. But I am very interested about the formative tendency, because one problem that the PCA has is about only the person, no? And what happened with the other person and the environmental and the social problems where everybody live and everything. If you can explain more about it, I'm interested.
Yeah, I'll try. One thing that I've always thought is that to a certain extent, when we're working with clients, they are increasing their empathy and their unconditional positive regard, and there's some therapeutic effect sometimes for the therapist, and it's a reciprocal kind of process. That's my own phenomenology of it. I only know of about one research study that looked at that, but I think that's kind of related to the idea of the formative tendency. I will say that Rogers writes about the formative tendency in only two places that I know of. Both I think 1978 is the first one, 1980 is the second, maybe, something like that. I have two articles on the formative tendency. One of those got me invited to go do a lecture in Brazil, where the formative tendency has been explored more in Portuguese, I think, than in English, and at least fits with some spiritual ideas that were prominent among the researchers in Brazil interested in that. So those are a couple places where you could read about it more. In a way, I have not read any of that very recently, so I'm cautious to say too much in case I don't say it quite right. But one way to think about the formative tendency is that at levels below the individual, like all those neuroscientific ways, or at levels above the individual, there may still be some kind of tendency to maintain and enhance, and that's his hypothesis that in a way the actualizing tendency and the formative tendency are somewhat explaining motivation in people, and to a certain extent crystals and the universe and other groovy things.
Hello, Jeff.
Hi.
My doubt is only in this part of multiculturalism. I'm very interested in this definition that you give to us. From where you get this definition, or how did you construct this definition? This is my first question. My second question is if you have found some work in multiculturalism and how it relates to the person-centered approach. If you can give me some advice to consult in this specific topic.
Okay. To be honest, I don't remember how I got this definition. I have a feeling it was like Wikipedia, Google. It's like, and then I was like, I'm not going to plagiarize this, but I'm going to use the basic concept that I see here. So I was trying to get a very kind of general definition. I first connected American Counseling Association's multicultural competencies with the core conditions in an article from maybe 2005 in the journal Person-Centered Practice, which is no longer in circulation. In particular, I was looking at Sue and Sue's formulations. If you know them, they're prominent multicultural advocates in American Counseling Association, and they have a book that's used by a lot of the programs in the United States, in part because they had a kind of negative view of the person-centered approach as a very individualistic approach that does not fit well with the values and themes of a variety of cultures of color throughout the world. And my assertion, however, is that the person-centered approach, while originated largely by one white male from America whose family goes back in America to the first settlers of America, so it's like very American, if I can say the word America again. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, but when you look at how was it developed, was very much in response to a variety of cultures from a relatively early age in his development, and immediately the applications involved cross-cultural things in a way that I don't think is quite as easy to find in, for example, psychoanalytic or behavioral kinds of formulations. I also think that it's a big misrepresentation of the person-centered approach to think of it as an individualistic approach. I think the main theme for practitioners is explicitly the opposite of that it's explicitly relational, and that the notion of suffering is problems in relationships, and that the solution is better relationships. So while the motivation and the respect for the individual are highly individualized, the context in which it was developed, the context in which it's practiced, the context in which it's applied is very multicultural. So in a way, it's kind of like, I know it's a long answer to your question, sorry, but my thinking is that there are many roots that you can look to in that. And here's another one. There was one study done internationally with people from several different continents on what was therapists' preferred orientations. So systems theory, cognitive behavioral, dynamic, humanistic. People of color throughout the world more identified as humanistic than any other approach. So I think just from the standpoint of what speaks to practitioners, often there's something to humanism that's not so highly individualistic.
You do have like a couple of slides at the end that has to do with the workforce, with the workplace. I mean, the person-centered approach within the workplace. I would like to have a photo of those slides and ask you also about your experience, bringing the approach into the workplace. What is successful, what doesn't work? What's your experience within organizations?
Here's the picture. Opportunity. Do you want it like this might be better? And then there's this. So you got this one? Okay. Do you want this one? Okay. I'm a little confused what I'm being asked. Go forward, backward. This one?
Yeah.
Just leave the slide there.
And the other one, please. Just the prior to that one. Yeah, that one, please. Thank you so much.
Okay. So my colleague and co-editor on this book, Renata Machnig at the University of Vienna, is much more an expert in this. There's also a person named, correct me, Alberto, David Richlock? Yes. And they're currently working on a book that's specifically on person-centered leadership in organizations. I contributed a chapter on that because there's several case studies of people who've been leaders in organizations that espouse some kind of association to the person-centered approach. They are better people for you to contact than me. So one study, I did do a small meta-synthesis of studies on the person-centered approach in management that appears in English and German, along with the review of, oh gosh, I'm not even remember correctly, person-centered education, management, and maybe a third thing. So I did do a little synthesis. I don't think it's not very well done compared to the education ones or the psychotherapy ones, but there is a research synthesis that I looked at that. But as far as doing original studies or applications and training people in organizational leadership, I'm not a very good person to say very much about it. I do work with doctoral students in a educational leadership and policy analysis program, but they don't usually have anything to do with the person-centered approach in any explicit way. Because the way that program is taught doesn't involve that, where the counseling program that I'm primarily located has more involvement with person-centered approach. There's a whole bunch to say, I don't know, and a few other people that I can connect you with, and that there is some research that I looked at, but it's not familiar in my mind enough to comment on it.
Jeff,
Ernie Meadows would be another good one, especially in terms of a practitioner and having trained people over time more so than as a researcher. And he's associated with the Center for the Studies of the Person. And Alberto could hook you up with him better than me. I don't think I know him personally, but. Other questions? Sally?
You say you show something about the relationship with PCA and attachment theories. Can you say something about that?
Probably not. In large part, I've been involved in trying to help bring people together, but I'm not an expert in a lot of this interdisciplinary research. So I have not studied attachment theory other than reading a couple things. I have not done research, but I could try to interpret the figure for you since I was somewhat involved in the creation of it. So the editors created all of these concept maps, and some of them, like this one, are based upon an author's work. So the author was the one who did all of the work linking them, and then we used the chapter to devise concept maps that explained what the author's perspective was. But I was not really involved with the original formulation, and most of the concept maps Renato was the primary creator of, particularly this one. So I'm sorry.
¿Algún otro comentario? ¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Thank you very much. Just if you can tell us a little bit about the 6th condition. We are very familiar with the 3 conditions of the person-centered approach, but the 3 other conditions are I think are interesting. So if you can tell us a little bit more about that 3 other conditions.
Sure. So all 6 are, if these 6 are present, then positive personality change was the original term, but I don't think counseling is actually very good at changing personality. It's much better at changing quality of life or symptoms, but the original formulation was the idea of personality change. And the first one was if 2 people are in contact, like there's a basic relationship, and then over time, the work of Prouty in particular has articulated what contact might mean in terms of reality contact, contact with others, contacts with self in a basic way. The second one was incongruence, which also had synonyms of vulnerability or anxiety. And the basic idea is that there is a conflict between someone's overall experience and their self-concept. So people have trouble sometimes accepting things that they feel or things that they experience, and that conflict between the way they normally think of themselves and the experience they're having is incongruence. But therein lies the opportunity for the persons to become more self-accepting or for them to expand their self-concept. So incongruence is the kind of main concept for psychopathology in the person-centered approach. But really, to me, I think it's more useful to just think about tension or latent meaning or concepts like that I think have a little bit more clinical or teachable applicability. I'm not a big fan of the personality theory and psychopathology theory of the person-centered approach. I think the application of that is more important and is more validated. The last one is perception, although sometimes it appears in Roger's writings as the communication of the therapist of the 3 core conditions. I prefer the perception one because of the measurement element involved in perception, and because to me it makes an easier feedback loop, which helps my formulation in relation to common factors and to the importance of person-centered approach adapting over time to what we learn in research, and to think about the person-centered approach as a way of being and attitudes, but not a restrictive, dogmatic practice that can't involve techniques or other kinds of applications. I believe people are very diverse, and that the way that they want to be interacted with is equally diverse. I think the general stance needs to be one of genuine empathy and unconditional positive regard, but how that gets played out in real life, I think the condition of perception helps me to be more integrative about that.
Thank you. Let me see if I can if I can explain my ideas. My first question is, I think that an important concept in a person-centered approach is about the self. And I think that is an concept that is not explained sufficiently, and we don't have many researches about it. How do you think about it? About this? This is my first question. And the second is how person-centered approach can include another perspectives or another concepts that can that are formulated in another perspectives, social perspective of psychological perspectives.
Okay, I think I tracked that well. Let's see if I can remember while I'm formulating an answer. The self-concept, I think, is important in explaining the theory originally, particularly the personality theory and the view of psychopathology. I think that there was more interest in the idea of self-concept early on in the approach and in related approaches at the time, and some of the research is quite old. I'm a fan of self-determination theory. Deci and Ryans and their colleagues are responsible for hundreds of studies in psychotherapy, education, a variety of practices in life, and some of the basic formulations of self-determination theory fit very well with the formulations of the person-centered approach. There's been multiple things about that written more recently, and so I guess I would think if I were interested in those concepts, I would probably look to self-determination theory or some other theories, but that's the first one that comes to mind as a well-validated theory that has very similar kinds of values as the person-centered approach. The second question was partly about other perspectives and integration, and I think that Rogers was particularly cautious about orthodoxy. He did not want to have happen with his theory what happened with Freudian or Jungian kinds of analysis, where it has a purist or almost religious overtone about what's correct, what's right, or how things should be done, what is really happening, what's the real meaning of things. So I think he was interested in a variety of perspectives always, sort of initially his value of openness to a variety of perspectives. And when you look at some of the earliest writings, there were applications and different perspectives apparent right away. And then certainly over time with like these interdisciplinary research collections, the idea is that there can be influence from other theories, and that the person-centered approach is often sometimes mysteriously explained from long ago about things that we now are able to measure. So I think that I don't know if this is the type of answer you were looking about in terms of different perspectives or integrating things, but my own view, I was trained classically at the Chicago Counseling Center where the person-centered approach kind of developed, which was very non-directive, but my views have always been much more integrative about what really happens in the world when you apply the person-centered approach, and how that is inherently multicultural and adaptive and humbling, that one should never believe that they know everything. And I'll just end with, one of Rogers' famous quotes is that the facts are always friendly. So there's a sense of openness that he always had, that while he stuck in some respects to the same formulations over time, he was always interested in anything that might be related to it. So.
Bueno, pues con esto cerramos la conferencia del doctor Jeff. Le vamos a hacer entrega de su reconocimiento y una medalla justamente de aquí de la universidad que conmemora su visita. Así que, pues bueno, pues un fuerte aplauso para el doctor. Y pues nada más me resta pues agradecerle su estadía aquí con nosotros y pues que tengan una excelente tarde. Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.
Thank you. Great, thanks.